Close your eyes and let yourself drift into the ancient depths of the labyrinth, where stone corridors wind endlessly into shadow and legend breathes in every corner. The island of Crete rises from the Mediterranean like a jewel, its mountains stark against the endless blue of sea and sky. In the age of heroes, when gods still walked among mortals, and monsters lurked at the edges of civilization, Crete was the mightiest kingdom in all the known world. Its power stretched across the waves, its ships controlled the trade routes, and its influence was felt from Egypt to the Greek mainland. At the heart of this power stood the Palace of Knossos, a sprawling complex of 1,000 rooms, where King Minos ruled with wisdom and strength. But before Minos became king, before Knossos became the center of an empire, there was a contest for power, a struggle that would set in motion events far darker than anyone could have imagined. You see, Minos was not the only son of the mighty Zeus and the mortal woman Europa. He had 2 brothers, Rhadamanthys and Sarpedon, and all 3 of them believed they had the right to rule Crete. The question of succession hung over the island like a storm cloud, threatening to tear the kingdom apart before it could reach its destined greatness. Minos, perhaps the most ambitious of the 3, understood that he needed more than mere words to claim the throne. He needed a sign from the gods themselves, an unmistakable demonstration of divine favor that would silence any challenge to his authority. And so Minos did what mortals so often do when they seek the gods' attention. He went to the shore and made a sacrifice to Poseidon, the lord of the seas and earthquakes, the god whose power was felt most keenly on an island kingdom like Crete. Kneeling on the beach with the salt spray in his face and the waves crashing behind him, Minos called out to the god of the ocean depths. He asked for a sign, a miracle that would prove beyond any doubt that the gods favored him above his brothers. And more than that, Minos made a vow. He promised that whatever sign Poseidon sent, he would sacrifice it back to the god as an offering, a demonstration of his piety and his worthiness to rule. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the sea and the crying of gulls. Then the waters began to churn and foam, and from the depths rose a creature so magnificent that even Minos, who had seen many wonders in his life, caught his breath in astonishment. It was a bull, but unlike any bull that had ever walked the earth. Its hide was pure white, brilliant as snow, unmarked by any blemish or imperfection. Its horns curved like crescents of polished ivory. Its eyes gleamed with an intelligence that seemed almost divine. The creature moved with a grace that belied its massive size, each muscle flowing beneath its gleaming coat like water under silk. The bull emerged from the waves and stood before Minos, shaking the sea water from its flanks. It was clearly a gift from Poseidon himself, a creature born of divine power, beautiful beyond measure and radiating an aura of sanctity that made it clear this was no ordinary animal. Minos' brothers and all who had gathered to witness his prayer fell to their knees. The sign could not have been clearer. The gods favored Minos. The kingdom was his, and so Minos became king of Crete, and his rule began with the greatest of all possible omens. But here's where the story takes a dark turn, where pride and greed planted the seeds of a curse that would haunt Crete for a generation. Minos looked upon the magnificent white bull, and he thought about the promise he had made. He had vowed to sacrifice this creature back to Poseidon. But as he watched the bull move, as he admired its perfect beauty, as he thought about how such an animal could improve his herds and bring prestige to his stables, a temptation crept into his heart. Surely, Minos reasoned to himself, Poseidon would not mind if he kept this magnificent beast and sacrificed a different bull in its place. The god had already given him the sign he needed. The kingship was secure. What did it matter which bull was sacrificed? The important thing was the gesture, the ritual acknowledgement of the god's power. Any bull would serve that purpose. This particular bull was too valuable, too perfect, to simply slaughter on an altar. It should be preserved, bred, used to strengthen the herds of Crete. It was a rationalization, of course, the kind of self-justification that humans excel at when they want something they know they shouldn't have. And, like so many rationalizations, it would prove to be disastrously wrong. Minos took the white bull to his stables instead of to the altar. He selected another bull, a fine specimen but ordinary, and sacrificed that animal to Poseidon instead. The ritual was performed. The proper words were said. On the surface, everything seemed fine, but the gods, especially the gods of ancient Greece, did not accept substitutions when it came to vows. A promise made was a promise to be kept, exactly as spoken, with no clever evasions or convenient reinterpretations. Poseidon knew immediately what Minos had done, the god who commanded the depths of the ocean, who could shake the earth with his trident, who drowned cities and saved sailors at his whim, was not fooled by Minos' deception. And Poseidon, like all the Olympian gods, did not forgive easily. The punishment that Poseidon devised for Minos' broken vow was both terrible and perverse, the kind of twisted justice that the Greek gods seemed to specialize in. Instead of punishing Minos directly, Poseidon chose to strike at him through his family, to create a shame so deep and a horror so profound that Minos would regret his greed for the rest of his days. The god turned his attention to Pasiphae, Minos' wife and the queen of Crete. Pasiphae was no ordinary woman. She was the daughter of Helios, the Titan god of the sun, and the Oceanid Perseus. Divine blood ran in her veins, making her immortal, and she was gifted with knowledge of witchcraft and herb lore, skills she shared with her siblings, the sorceress Circe and Aeates, the guardian of the Golden Fleece. Pasiphae was beautiful, powerful, and intelligent, a worthy queen for a great king. She had borne Minos several children already, including daughters Ariadne and Phaedra, and she ruled at his side with wisdom and grace. But Poseidon cared nothing for her virtues or her innocence in her husband's crime. The god cast a curse upon the queen, twisting her mind and heart in the most unnatural way imaginable. He made Pasiphae fall desperately, overwhelmingly, uncontrollably in love with the white bull. Not merely attracted to it, that would have been strange enough, but consumed with desire for it, obsessed with it, driven to madness by an impossible longing that grew stronger with each passing day. At first, Pasiphae tried to resist the curse. She knew the feelings were wrong, unnatural, a violation of the very order of nature. She stayed away from the stables where the bull was kept. She occupied herself with her duties as queen, with her children, with anything that might distract her from the insane compulsion that gripped her heart. But the curse was too strong. It was divine in origin, woven by a god's power, and mortal will, even the will of an immortal woman, could not stand against it. The queen grew pale and thin. She could not eat, could not sleep. Her every waking thought was of the bull. She wandered the palace at night, her mind fevered, her body trembling with a desire she could neither satisfy nor suppress. Finally, in desperation, knowing she would go truly mad if she did not find some way to fulfill the cursed longing, Pasiphae turned to the only person in Crete who might be able to help her, Daedalus, the master craftsman. Daedalus was an Athenian by birth, a genius inventor and architect who had fled his homeland after murdering his nephew Talos in a fit of jealous rage. The nephew had been his apprentice, a young man of such brilliant talent that Daedalus feared he would one day surpass his master. Unable to bear the thought, Daedalus had thrown the boy from the Acropolis in Athens, saved from certain death by the goddess Athena, who transformed him into a partridge. Talos survived, but Daedalus was forced to flee Athens as a murderer and kinslayer. He found refuge in Crete, where King Minos, recognizing his extraordinary abilities, welcomed him to the court. Daedalus was the greatest craftsman of his age, a man who could build anything imaginable and quite a few things that seemed impossible. His hands could shape wood and stone and metal into forms of such precision and beauty that people swore his statues were alive, that they breathed and moved when no one was watching. He understood mechanisms and engineering in a way no one else did. If anyone could solve an impossible problem, it was Daedalus. When Pasiphae came to him, desperate and ashamed, and told him what she needed, Daedalus must have been horrified, but he was also a pragmatist, a man who solved technical problems without always considering the moral implications. The queen was his patroness. She needed his help, and perhaps in his twisted way, he found the challenge intellectually intriguing. Could it be done? Could he create a device that would allow a human woman to mate with a bull? Working in secret in his workshop, Daedalus constructed an apparatus that was both a marvel of engineering and an abomination against nature. He built a hollow wooden cow, life-sized and perfectly detailed. He covered the frame with real cowhide, stitched and treated to look and feel like living flesh. The construction was so realistic that from the outside it appeared to be a genuine animal, but inside was a hollow space, a cavity designed for a human occupant, with openings positioned so that the inhabitant could, well, suffice it to say that Daedalus engineered the contraption to serve its terrible purpose. When the wooden cow was complete, Daedalus brought it to Pasiphae, the queen, by this point beyond shame, beyond reason, consumed entirely by the divine curse that had been placed upon her, climbed inside the hollow structure without hesitation. Daedalus wheeled the contraption out to the meadow where the white bull grazed, positioned it carefully, and then withdrew, leaving the queen to her cursed fate. What happened next is too bizarre and too disturbing to dwell on in detail. Suffice it to say that the white bull, deceived by Daedalus's craftsmanship, approached the wooden cow as if it were real. The curse upon Pasiphae was fulfilled. The unnatural union took place, and in that moment, in that violation of the natural order brought about by a king's greed and a god's revenge, something monstrous was conceived. Months passed. Pasiphae, freed from the overwhelming compulsion once the curse had been satisfied, returned to her life in the palace, trying desperately to forget what had happened, what she had been forced to do by divine power beyond her control. But she could not forget, because the evidence grew within her. She was pregnant, and as the pregnancy progressed, she realized with growing horror that the child she carried was not human. When the time came for the birth, the midwives who attended Pasiphae emerged from the birthing chamber white-faced and trembling, scarcely able to speak of what they had seen. The queen had given birth to a creature that should not exist, a being that violated every law of nature. It had the body of a man, or mostly, at least, muscular and powerful, but its head was that of a bull, complete with horns and a snout, and its nature was entirely bestial. It did not cry like a human infant. It bellowed like a bull calf. And in its eyes there was nothing of human intelligence or compassion, only animal hunger and rage. Pasiphae, in the fragmentary accounts that survive, is said to have initially tried to nurse the creature as if it were a normal child. Perhaps maternal instinct overrode her horror. Perhaps she felt guilt for her role in its creation, cursed though she had been. But as the creature grew, as it became clear that it would never be anything resembling human, that it fed on human flesh and could not be tamed or reasoned with, even a mother's love could not sustain the pretense that this was simply an unusual child. The creature was given a name, Asterion, after Minos' grandfather, but it was not known by that name. Instead, it was called the Minotaur, which means bull of Minos, a constant reminder of the king's transgression, of the bull he had kept when he should have sacrificed it, and of the terrible price his family paid for that decision. The Minotaur was Minos' shame made flesh, a monster that stood as proof of the king's hubris and the god's power. Minos faced an impossible dilemma. He could not kill the creature. It was, after all, his wife's child, and moreover, destroying it might bring down further divine wrath. But neither could he allow it to roam free. The Minotaur was dangerous, violent, a man-eater that grew more savage as it matured. It had to be confined, imprisoned somewhere secure where it could not harm Minos' people, but where it would remain alive. And so Minos turned once again to Daedalus, the man whose genius had enabled the creature's conception in the first place. This time the commission was for a prison, but not an ordinary prison. It had to be escape-proof, capable of holding a monster of superhuman strength. It had to be so confusing, so disorienting, that even if the Minotaur broke free from any physical restraints, it could never find its way out. And it had to be secret, hidden away beneath the palace where the shame of the royal family could be buried along with its monstrous offspring. What Daedalus created was a structure that would become legendary, a construction so famous and so symbolic that its name has entered language as a metaphor for anything confusing or impossible to navigate. He built the Labyrinth. The Labyrinth, Daedalus' masterpiece. The Labyrinth was Daedalus' greatest and most terrible achievement, the work that would make his name immortal even as it trapped him and his son in its consequences. To understand the Labyrinth, you must first understand the genius of the man who built it. Daedalus was not merely skilled with his hands. He understood principles of architecture and psychology that would not be formally articulated for centuries to come. He knew how to manipulate space and perception, how to create structures that confused the senses and defied intuition. The labyrinth was built deep beneath the palace of Knossos, carved into the living rock, a descending warren of passages and chambers that sprawled for what must have seemed like miles. Some ancient accounts claim that Daedalus fashioned the labyrinth to mimic the Egyptian labyrinth at Lake Moeris, which was said to contain 3,000 rooms and no exit. Others say he designed it based on mathematical principles, using precise geometric patterns that created a space more confusing than random chaos ever could. What made the labyrinth truly maddening was not its size, though it was vast, but its design. Daedalus created a maze where every corridor looked like every other corridor. The walls were uniform, the turns indistinguishable. A person walking through the labyrinth would quickly lose all sense of direction, unable to tell if they were going deeper into the maze or making progress toward the exit. Dead ends appeared without warning. Passages that seemed promising would loop back on themselves. A route that had led one direction before would mysteriously take a different turn when retraced. Some versions of the myth suggest that the labyrinth was not merely confusing, but actually changed its configuration, that corridors moved and rearranged themselves, making it impossible to map or memorize. Whether this was literally true, or simply how it felt to anyone trapped within its corridors, is impossible to say. What is certain is that the labyrinth achieved its purpose perfectly. Once someone entered, they could never find their way back out. At the heart of the labyrinth, at its deepest and darkest point, Daedalus constructed a great chamber. This was where the Minotaur would live, fed through a complex system of passages that allowed food to be delivered without anyone having to confront the monster directly. The chamber was littered with bones, the remains of whatever or whoever had been fed to the beast to sustain its terrible appetite. According to the legend, the labyrinth was so cunningly designed that even Daedalus himself could barely find his way out after completing its construction. He had to mark his path with chalk or thread, the accounts vary, to avoid becoming lost in his own creation. This detail is significant because it establishes an important precedent, one that will become crucial later in our story. If the architect himself needed a guide to escape, what chance did anyone else have? The Minotaur was sealed within the labyrinth, imprisoned in eternal darkness and confusion, fed periodically but never seen, never spoken to, never touched by any hand with kindness or compassion. It lived in the depths like a terrible secret, like something shameful that had to be hidden away, but could never be destroyed, and there it might have remained. A family secret that eventually faded into obscurity, except that King Minos' troubles were far from over. The monster in the maze was only the beginning. The true horror, the part of the story that would draw in Athens, that would lead to Theseus's heroic quest, that would make the Minotaur's name echo through history, had not yet begun. That horror would emerge from tragedy, from war, from a father's grief, and a king's revenge. But before we come to that, we must understand the monster itself, not just as a creature of nightmare, but as a being trapped in a labyrinth of circumstances beyond its control. The Minotaur was a victim as much as it was a monster. It did not ask to be born. It had no choice about its nature, its appetites, its appearance. It was the product of a curse, brought into being by a god's vengeance against a king's pride, and its mother had no agency in its conception. In more modern retellings of the myth, some authors have portrayed the Minotaur with sympathy as a tragic figure imprisoned from birth, sentenced to darkness and isolation for the crime of merely existing. But in the ancient versions of the tale, the Minotaur was presented as a straightforward monster, a creature that fed on human flesh, that bellowed in rage and struck down anyone who came near it. The ancient Greeks did not concern themselves much with the monster's inner life, or whether it might have become something different under different circumstances. They saw it as a threat, a horror, something that needed to be contained or destroyed. The labyrinth was necessary because the Minotaur was dangerous, and that danger would soon spread beyond the walls of Knossos. The double axe symbol that appeared throughout Knossos, the Labyrinth, is thought by many scholars to have given the labyrinth its name. The word labyrinth might derive from Labyrinth, meaning place of the double axe. This sacred symbol appeared on walls, on pottery, on ritual objects throughout Minoan Crete. Some theories suggest that the labyrinth itself was originally a religious structure, a ritual space where ceremonies involving the sacred bull took place, and that the myth of the Minotaur grew from these ancient rites. When archaeologists began excavating Knossos in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they found a palace so complex, with so many corridors and stairways and rooms, that they immediately thought of the legendary labyrinth. The palace itself seemed labyrinthine, a sprawling structure that could easily confuse visitors. Was this the inspiration for the myth? Did travelers to ancient Crete see the palace at Knossos and, not understanding its structure, transform their confusion into the legend of an impossible maze containing a monster? We will return to these archaeological mysteries later. For now, we need to follow the thread of the myth forward to the event that would transform the Minotaur from a family shame into an instrument of vengeance against Athens, and ultimately lead a young hero named Theseus to volunteer for what seemed like certain death in the depths of the labyrinth. Athens under tribute, the price of war. The story of how Athens became entangled with the Minotaur begins not in Crete, but in Athens itself, and not with monsters, but with athletic games and the pride of young men. King Minos had a son named Androgeos, a young man of exceptional talent, particularly in athletics. When the Athenians decided to hold great games, competitions in running, wrestling, discus throwing, and other contests of strength and skill, Androgeos decided to participate, eager to prove himself against the finest athletes Athens had to offer. Androgeos dominated the games. He won event after event, his skill and strength proving superior to all the Athenian competitors. The crowds cheered for him, amazed by his prowess. But among the Athenian athletes and nobles, a darker emotion began to grow: jealousy. Here was this young man from Crete, from a foreign island, making Athens' finest athletes look like clumsy amateurs. Some of the Athenians began to mutter that it wasn't right, that Androgeus was showing them up in their own city, that something had to be done. The exact circumstances of what happened next are murky in the surviving accounts. Some versions say that King Aegeus of Athens, threatened by Androgeus' popularity and fearing that the young Cretan might become a rallying point for political opposition, ordered his assassination. Other accounts claim that jealous athletes from Athens, acting on their own, murdered Androgeos to prevent him from winning any more competitions and embarrassing them further. Still others suggest that Aegeus sent Androgeus to face the wild bull of Marathon, the same white bull that had sired the Minotaur, and that the beast killed him. Regardless of the exact details, the outcome was the same. Androgeus was dead, killed in Athens under circumstances that made it clear the Athenians were responsible. When word reached Crete, when Minos learned that his son had been murdered, the king's grief transformed instantly into rage. Androgeos had been the heir to Crete's throne, the pride of Minos' heart, a young man of promise who would never now fulfill his potential. The king had already suffered the shame of the Minotaur, already endured the god's punishment for his broken vow. Now this. Minos called up his fleet, the greatest navy in the Mediterranean world, and sailed for Athens with an army at his back, bent on revenge. The war that followed was brutal and one-sided. Crete's power far exceeded that of Athens, and Minos laid siege to the city with the clear intention of razing it to the ground and enslaving or slaughtering its people. The Athenians fought bravely, but they were outmatched. Their walls would not hold forever, and they knew it. But the gods had not finished punishing Athens. At the same time as Minos' siege, a plague descended upon the city, a divine punishment sent, depending on the account, either to avenge Androgeos' death, or simply because Athens had displeased the gods in some way. The plague killed indiscriminately, and the Athenians found themselves fighting a war on two fronts, against Minos' army outside their walls and against disease within them. Desperate, King Aegeus consulted the oracle at Delphi, seeking guidance on how to appease the gods and save his city. The oracle's response was cryptic and terrible. Athens must submit to whatever terms Minos demanded. There was no other way to end the war, no military solution, no clever trick that would allow them to escape their fate. They had killed Minos' son, and now they would pay the price. Aegeus sent emissaries to Minos, offering unconditional surrender. They would accept any terms, pay any price, if only the siege would end and the plague would be lifted. And Minos, standing in his war camp outside Athens' walls, contemplated what punishment would best satisfy his grief and his rage. He thought of his son, the young man who had gone to Athens in good faith, seeking only to test himself in honorable competition, and who had been treacherously murdered for his excellence. He thought of the Minotaur, the monster hidden beneath his palace, a creature that fed on human flesh. The punishment Minos devised was as cruel as it was clever. He would not destroy Athens. That would be too quick, too clean. Instead, he would make the Athenians suffer year after year, generation after generation. They would never forget what they had done. They would pay forever for the murder of Androgeos. Minos demanded tribute every 9 years. In some versions, every year. Athens would send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete. These had to be Athens' finest youth, the best and most noble young people the city could produce. They would be sent on a ship with black sails, the color of mourning, because every Athenian knew what fate awaited these young people when they reached Crete. They would be fed to the Minotaur. The terms were designed for maximum psychological torture. Parents would have to give up their children, knowing exactly what would happen to them. The youth chosen would have weeks aboard the ship to contemplate their doom, plenty of time for terror to build. And Athens as a whole would be reminded at regular intervals, for the consequences of betraying Crete, of killing Androgeos. The tribute would continue indefinitely, a wound that could never fully heal, a shame that could never be forgotten. Aegeus had no choice but to accept. The alternative was the complete destruction of Athens. The terms were agreed to, and Minos lifted his siege and sailed back to Crete, satisfied that he had found a revenge more terrible than simple conquest would have been. The plague, perhaps pleased by Athens' humiliation, or perhaps simply having run its course, subsided as well. Athens survived, but at a cost that would haunt the city for years to come. When the first tribute was due, lots were drawn among the young people of Athens to determine who would be sent. Can you imagine the scene? 14 young men and women, in the prime of their lives, standing before their families, knowing that some of them were about to be sentenced to a horrible death. The names were drawn one by one. The chosen wept. Their families wept. The entire city mourned. The 14 were escorted to the ship with the black sails. The ship itself became a symbol of death, a floating coffin that would carry them across the sea to Crete. They sailed, and Athens waited in anguish for news that would never come because none of the tributes ever returned. They were delivered to Knossos, led down into the depths of the palace, and pushed into the labyrinth. And there, in the darkness and confusion, lost among corridors that all looked the same, they eventually encountered the Minotaur. We can only imagine what those final moments were like. The youth wandering in the dark, perhaps, calling out to each other, trying to stay together. The growing sound of the Minotaur's breathing, its bestial grunts echoing through the stone passages. The moment when they saw it, when they realized that all hope was gone, the desperate, futile attempts to fight or flee, and finally, the silence as the monster fed. This happened every 9 years, or every year, depending on which version of the myth you follow. 14 young people, again and again, sent to certain death. The second tribute was drawn, the third. Each time more families were torn apart, more youth lost to the insatiable appetite of the monster in the maze. Athens endured this agony because they had no choice, because they were weaker than Crete, because the gods seemed to have turned their faces away from the city. But then came the year when the third tribute was due, or perhaps the fourth or fifth. The sources disagree on this point, and something changed. A young man in Athens, the son of King Aegeus himself, heard about the tribute and made a decision that would alter the course of the story forever. His name was Theseus, and he volunteered to be one of the 14, not to die in the labyrinth, but to kill the Minotaur and end the terrible tribute once and for all. Before we follow Theseus to Crete, we need to understand who he was, where he came from, and what had made him into the kind of person who would volunteer for such a mission. His story begins not in Athens, but far to the south, in the small city of Troezen, with a mysterious conception and a childhood spent wondering about his father's identity. Theseus, the hero's origins and journey to Athens, in the city of Troezen, nestled on the eastern coast of the Peloponnese. There lived a princess named Aethra, daughter of King Pythias. She was beautiful and intelligent, and her father was renowned for his wisdom, a king whom even the oracle at Delphi respected. When Aegeus, the king of Athens, came to Troezen seeking counsel from Pythias about a puzzling prophecy, he met Aethra, and whether through genuine affection, political arrangement, or the mysterious workings of fate, they spent a night together. But here the myth becomes complex because Theseus, like many Greek heroes, had a claim to dual parentage. On the same night that Aethra lay with Aegeus, she was also visited by Poseidon, the god of the sea. Some versions of the myth say that the goddess Athena herself led Aethra to the shore where the god took her. Other accounts suggest that Poseidon simply claimed the unborn child as his own, the way gods sometimes did when they wanted to enhance a mortal's destiny. So Theseus grew up with a question mark hovering over his origins. Was he the son of a king or the son of a god? The ambiguity would follow him throughout his life, and he would demonstrate characteristics that suggested both mortal and divine heritage, the cunning and political skill of a king, but also the strength and destiny of a demigod. Aegeus, for his part, did not stay in Troezen. He returned to Athens before Aethra knew she was pregnant. But before leaving, he made careful preparations. He took Aethra to a large, flat rock outside the city, and with great effort lifted it. Beneath the rock, he placed his sword and his sandals, tokens of his identity and authority. Then he told Aethra that if she bore a son, she should raise him in secret, and when the boy was strong enough to lift the rock and retrieve these items, he should send him to Athens. These tokens would prove his identity to Aegeus and establish his claim as the king's heir. Why all this secrecy? Because Athens was not a safe place for Aegeus's potential heirs. The king had 50 nephews, the sons of his brother Pallas, all of whom had designs on the throne. If they learned that Aegeus had a legitimate son, they would certainly try to kill the child. Better that Theseus grow up far from Athens, unknown and unregarded, until he was strong enough to claim his birthright and defend it. And so Theseus was raised in Troezen by his mother and his grandfather Pythias, who recognized the boy's potential and saw to his education. Theseus grew strong and quick, brave and clever. He trained in the arts of war, studied wisdom with his grandfather, and learned the stories of the great heroes who had come before him, Heracles most of all, the mighty demigod who had performed 12 great labors, and was revered throughout Greece as the greatest hero of all time. But Theseus did not know who his father was. Aethra kept that secret, waiting for the right time. The other boys in Troezen sometimes mocked Theseus, saying he had no father, or that his father was ashamed of him and would never acknowledge him. These taunts stung, and Theseus endured them with what patience he could muster, waiting for the day when his mother would tell him the truth. That day came when Theseus had grown into young manhood, tall and strong, quick-minded and brave. Aethra took him to the rock where Aegeus had hidden his tokens 16 or 17 years before. She told him the story of that night, of the sword and sandals waiting beneath the stone. Other young men had tried to lift the rock over the years. It was known in Troezen as a test of strength, and all had failed. The stone was simply too heavy for any ordinary man to move. But Theseus was no ordinary man. Whether it was his divine parentage showing through or simply his exceptional strength, when Theseus put his hands beneath the rock and lifted, the massive stone rose, tipping over to reveal the hidden tokens beneath. The sword gleamed, still sharp after all these years. The sandals were exactly where Aegeus had left them. Theseus took these items, claimed them as his birthright, and listened as his mother explained what he needed to do next. He had to go to Athens. He had to present himself to King Aegeus and claim his place as the heir to the throne. But there were two ways to make the journey from Troezen to Athens. The safe way was by sea, a relatively short voyage that would take only a few days and avoid most dangers. The dangerous way was overland, following the coastal road around the Saronic Gulf, a route that was infested with bandits, monsters, and criminals who preyed on travelers. His mother and grandfather both urged Theseus to take the sea route. It was the sensible choice, the safe choice, the choice a wise person would make. But Theseus, fired with the ambition of youth and inspired by the example of Heracles, chose the overland route instead. He wanted to prove himself, to perform great deeds, to arrive in Athens not as a frightened boy seeking his father's protection, but as a hero in his own right, someone who had earned respect through his own actions. And so Theseus set out on the road to Athens, carrying his father's sword, wearing his father's sandals, looking for trouble rather than avoiding it. He would not have to look for long. The road from Troezen to Athens was called the Isthmus Road, and it was notorious throughout Greece as the most dangerous route in the civilized world. Along its length at strategic points where travelers could not easily bypass, 6 different criminals had set up their territories, each with their own particular method of murdering the travelers who passed through. These 6 encounters would become known as the Labors of Theseus, deliberately mirroring the 12 labors of Heracles, establishing Theseus as a hero cut from the same cloth as the mighty demigod. But where Heracles relied primarily on his incredible strength, Theseus would demonstrate a different kind of heroism, one that combined strength with cunning, that used the enemy's own methods against them, that relied as much on intelligence as on brute force. The first labor occurred at Epidaurus, a sacred site dedicated to Apollo and the healer Asclepius. Here Theseus encountered Periphetes, a giant of a man known as the Club Bearer, because he carried an enormous bronze club that he used to beat travelers to death. Periphetes was the son of Hephaestus, the smith god, and like his father, he walked with a limp. But this disability did not make him any less deadly. He would wait by the roadside, leaning on his club as if it were a walking stick. And when unwary travelers passed, he would suddenly swing the weapon with devastating force. Theseus approached, and Periphetes attacked. But Theseus was quicker than the giant expected. He dodged the first swing of the club, rolled under the second, and came up inside Periphetes' guard. Using a combination of wrestling skill and clever leverage, Theseus managed to disarm the bandit, taking the bronze club away from him. Then, in a demonstration of poetic justice that would become Theseus's signature approach, he used Periphetes' own weapon to beat the giant to death. Theseus kept the club, carrying it with him as a trophy and a weapon, much as Heracles had kept the skin of the Nemean lion. This would become one of his identifying symbols in art and sculpture. Theseus with his club, the weapon of his first defeated enemy. The second labor came at the Isthmus of Corinth itself, the narrowest point of the land bridge connecting the Peloponnese to mainland Greece. Here Theseus met Sinis, a criminal known as Pitiocamptes, or the Pinebender, because of his unusual and horrific method of execution. Sinas was enormously strong enough to bend pine trees down to the ground. He would ask travelers to help him hold a bent pine tree, and when they grabbed onto it, he would suddenly let go. The tree would snap upright, and the unfortunate traveler would be catapulted into the air, usually dying either from the impact or from the fall. In an even more gruesome variation, Sinis would tie his victims between two bent pine trees, then release both trees simultaneously, tearing the person in half. Theseus arrived, and Sinis began his routine, asking the young hero to help him with the pine tree. Theseus agreed, but when Sinis bent the tree down and Theseus grabbed it, the bandit was in for a surprise. Instead of being unable to hold the tree, Theseus held it firmly when Sinis let go. The tree did not snap back. Theseus's strength was more than equal to the task. Confused and perhaps frightened by this unexpected turn of events, Sinis bent down to examine the tree, perhaps thinking something was wrong with it. At that moment, Theseus released his grip. The pine tree shot upward, and Sinis, caught in its path, was struck with tremendous force. Theseus had used the bandit's own method against him, demonstrating that violence returned upon its perpetrator is justice of a sort. The third labor brought Theseus to the village of Crommyon, where he encountered the Crommyonian sow, a massive wild boar that had been terrorizing the region. This was not merely a large pig, but a true monster, said to be the offspring of the primordial monsters Echidna and Typhon. The sow had been devastating farmland, killing anyone who tried to stop it, and the locals were too frightened to hunt it themselves. Theseus took on the challenge, tracking the beast to its lair and engaging it in combat. Using the bronze club he had taken from Periphetes, Theseus fought the sow in a brutal battle that demonstrated his courage and skill in facing monsters. He emerged victorious, and the people of Crommyon were freed from their tormentor. Some versions of the story claim that the Crommyonian sow was actually a nickname for a violent woman named Phaea, who bred the actual beast and was as much a menace as the animal itself. In these versions, Theseus killed both the woman and the sow, cleansing the region of both threats. The fourth labor occurred near the town of Megara on the cliffs overlooking the sea. Here lived Siren, an old man who would force travelers to kneel and wash his feet. This might seem like mere humiliation, but Siren had a deadlier purpose. As the traveler knelt before him, focused on the degrading task, Siren would suddenly kick them over the cliff edge. Below, in the churning waters, a giant sea turtle waited to devour the victims who fell. When Theseus encountered Siren and was ordered to wash the old man's feet, he pretended to comply, kneeling as if to submit. But at the crucial moment, as Siren prepared to deliver his fatal kick, Theseus grabbed the old man's leg and threw him over the cliff instead. Siren fell screaming into the sea, where his own pet turtle devoured him. Again, the method of murder became the method of justice. The fifth labor tested Theseus's wrestling skills. At Eleusis, he met Cercion, the king of that city and a wrestling champion, who challenged every traveler to a match. Cercion had never lost a bout, and he killed everyone he defeated, which was everyone who accepted his challenge. The king relied on brute strength, overpowering his opponents through sheer physical force. But Theseus was no ordinary wrestler. He had been trained in technique as well as strength, understanding leverage and balance in ways that Cercion did not. When they grappled, Theseus used Cercyon's own weight and momentum against him, lifting the king high and then dashing him to the ground with such force that Cercyon's neck broke. This was perhaps the most impressive of Theseus's labors to this point, because it showed that he could defeat an opponent who might have been his physical equal through superior skill and intelligence. The sixth and final labor occurred between Eleusis and Athens itself, at a place where a sinister innkeeper named Procrustes ran what appeared to be a welcoming inn for weary travelers. Procrustes, whose name meant something like the stretcher, offered travelers a place to rest, a bed for the night. But this was no kindness. Procrustes had an obsession with making sure his guests fit the bed properly. If a traveler was too short for the bed, Procrustes would stretch them on a rack until they matched its length, usually killing them in the process. If a traveler was too tall, he would cut off their feet or their heads to make them fit. Either way, the traveler died, though Procrustes maintained the fiction that he was simply being a good host, ensuring his guests were comfortable. When Theseus arrived and was offered the bed, he understood immediately what was happening. Before Procrustes could spring his trap, Theseus overpowered the innkeeper and forced him onto his own bed. Theseus then measured Procrustes against the bed, and finding him too tall, cut off his head and feet to make him fit. Once again, Theseus had turned a killer's own method back on them. With the 6 labors complete, Theseus arrived in Athens bearing the tokens of his father's identity and having established himself as a formidable hero in his own right. He had cleared the most dangerous road in Greece of its criminal element. He had shown himself to be not just strong, but clever. Not just brave, but just. He was ready to claim his birthright and meet his father for the first time. But Athens held new dangers for Theseus. Dangers that came not from bandits or monsters, but from within the royal court itself. His father's nephews, the 50 sons of Pallas, were already plotting against him. And there was another threat as well, one that Theseus could not have anticipated. Medea, the sorceress, his father's new wife. But before we explore those palace intrigues, we need to fast forward through them to the moment that matters most for our story. The moment when Theseus learned about the tribute to Crete, about the Minotaur, about the 14 young Athenians who were about to be sent to their deaths, because it was that knowledge, that horror, that would drive Theseus to volunteer for the mission that would define his life and give meaning to all the labors he had completed on the road from Trozen. The volunteer, Theseus, joins the tribute. Theseus had been in Athens long enough to be recognized as Aegeus's heir, long enough to foil the plots of his cousins and survive Medea's attempts to poison him, long enough to become familiar with the rhythms and sorrows of the city. And so he was present when the time came for the third tribute to Crete, when lots would be drawn among the young people of Athens to determine who would be sent to feed the Minotaur. The scene in the great hall of Athens' palace must have been heartbreaking. 14 names had to be chosen from among the city's youth. 7 young men and 7 young women, all from noble families, all in the prime of their lives. The families gathered, white-faced with dread, as the names were prepared for the drawing. Everyone knew what this meant. 14 families would lose their children. 14 young people would die terrible deaths. in the darkness beneath Knossos. Theseus watched this scene, and something in him rebelled against it. This was wrong. This tribute was unjust. Yes, Androgeus had been killed in Athens. And yes, that killing had been dishonorable. But how many young Athenians had died since then? How much blood had Athens paid for that crime? When would the debt be considered settled? When would the suffering end? More than that, Theseus saw an opportunity. He had come to Athens to prove himself as a hero, to show that he was worthy to be Aegeus's heir. What better way to do that than by ending the tribute forever? If he could kill the Minotaur, if he could find a way to escape from the labyrinth, he would be saving not just the current 14, but all the tributes that would come after. He would free Athens from Crete's control. He would accomplish something that no one else had dared to attempt. So Theseus stood up and made an announcement that stunned everyone in the hall. He volunteered to be one of the 14. He, the king's son, the heir to Athens, would go to Crete with a tribute and face the Minotaur. The room erupted in chaos. Some people thought Theseus was insane. Others were moved by his courage. Still others saw it as a political ploy, a way to gain popularity by appearing brave. But Aegeus's reaction was the most extreme of all. The king was horrified. He had just found his son after years of separation, and now that son was volunteering to go on what was essentially a suicide mission. Aegeus begged Theseus to reconsider, argued that his duty as heir was to stay in Athens and eventually take the throne, not throw his life away in a futile gesture. But Theseus was adamant. He had made up his mind, and he was not the kind of person who backed down from a challenge. He assured his father that this was not a suicide mission, that he intended to kill the Minotaur and return home victorious. He asked for his father's blessing and his faith. Finally, Aegeus relented. He could not stop his son from going, and perhaps in his heart, he was proud of Theseus's courage, even as he feared for his life. But Aegeus extracted one promise from Theseus before he would agree. The ship that carried the tribute always sailed with black sails, the color of mourning and death. If Theseus survived, if he killed the Minotaur and escaped, he was to raise white sails as the ship returned to Athens. That way, Aegeus could see from a distance whether his son lived or died. White sails would mean victory and life. Black sails would mean the Minotaur had claimed another victim, even if that victim was the king's own son. Theseus agreed to this. He would change the sails from black to white if he survived. It seemed like a simple thing, an easy promise to keep, and with that settled, Theseus joined the 13 other chosen tributes as they prepared for the journey to Crete. The departure was a somber affair. The families of the tributes came to the harbor to say goodbye, many weeping openly, treating it as a funeral because that effectively was what it was. The tributes themselves faced their fate with varying degrees of courage. Some were brave, accepting their doom with stoic resignation. Others were terrified, barely able to function. All of them looked to Theseus with a mixture of hope and desperation. He was the king's son. He was a hero who had completed 6 labors. If anyone could save them, surely it was him. But Theseus, despite his confidence, did not actually have a plan. He knew he wanted to kill the Minotaur, but he didn't know how. He knew he wanted to escape the labyrinth, but he had no idea how to navigate it. He was relying on improvisation, on his strength and intelligence, on the hope that when the crucial moment came, he would figure out what to do. It was the confidence of youth, the belief that will and courage alone could overcome any obstacle. The ship with black sails departed Athens, carrying its cargo of condemned youth across the Aegean toward Crete. The journey gave Theseus time to think, to plan, to try to prepare himself mentally for what lay ahead. The other tributes looked to him for leadership, for reassurance, and he did his best to provide it, though he knew his words might prove hollow when they actually faced the monster. After several days at sea, the ship approached Crete, and the tributes got their first view of Knossos rising above the harbor. The palace was immense, sprawling, its buildings climbing the hillside in terraced levels. Even from a distance, it radiated power and wealth. This was the center of the greatest civilization in the Mediterranean world. The tributes were farmers' children from Attica being delivered to the palace of an empire. When they disembarked, they were met by Cretan guards, who looked at them with a mixture of pity and contempt. This happened every 9 years. The guards were used to it. They escorted the tributes up to the palace, through corridors decorated with frescoes of dolphins and octopi, past rooms filled with more wealth than most of the tributes had seen in their entire lives, until they came at last to the throne room where King Minos waited. Minos was old now, his beard white, his face lined with the years that had passed since his son Androgeus had been killed. But his eyes were still sharp, and his presence commanded respect. He looked at the 14 young Athenians standing before him, these latest victims of his long revenge. His expression was unreadable. Was there satisfaction in it? Sorrow, simple indifference. The tributes could not tell. Minos's eyes lingered on Theseus, perhaps recognizing something in the young man's bearing that set him apart from the others. Perhaps word had already reached Crete that Aegeus' son was among the tributes. If so, Minos might have felt a certain grim satisfaction. The son of the king who had killed his son was now here to feed Minos' other son, the monster in the labyrinth. There was a symmetry to it, a sense of cosmic balance. But if Minos felt anything, he did not show it. He simply gestured to the guards to take the tributes away. They would be kept in comfortable quarters for a few days, well fed and well treated. Crete was not cruel for the sake of cruelty. The tributes would be sent to the Minotaur rested and healthy. Some accounts even suggest that they were honored at a feast before being sent into the labyrinth, as if they were sacrificial victims being prepared for a religious rite. During these days of waiting, Theseus and the other tributes were allowed to move relatively freely within certain areas of the palace, and it was during this time that Theseus attracted the attention of someone who would prove absolutely crucial to his survival. Ariadne, the daughter of Minos and Pasiphae, the sister of the Minotaur. Ariadne, love in the palace of Knossos. Ariadne was a princess of Crete, a young woman of extraordinary beauty and intelligence, and she was as trapped in her own way as the monster that was her half-brother. She knew about the Minotaur, of course. Everyone in the palace knew about it, though it was a shameful secret that was never discussed openly. She knew about the tributes from Athens, knew that young people her own age were being fed to the beast every 9 years, and she hated it. But what could she do? She was a princess, yes, but she had no power to change her father's policies, no ability to end the tribute or free the monster. She lived in comfort and luxury while others died horribly, and the guilt of that knowledge weighed on her, even though the situation was not of her making. Like the Minotaur itself, Ariadne was caught in a web of consequences that had been spun long before her birth. When the latest tribute arrived and Ariadne caught her first glimpse of Theseus, something shifted in her heart. The ancient sources are frustratingly vague about exactly what she felt or why. Was it love at first sight, that instant connection that transcends rational explanation? Was it admiration for his courage in volunteering? Was it simply that he was handsome and carried himself like a hero? Or was it something deeper, a recognition that this was her chance to finally do something meaningful, to help someone, to take action against a situation she had been powerless to change? Whatever the reason, Ariadne found herself unable to stop thinking about Theseus. She watched him during the feast, noticed how he comforted the other tributes, how he maintained his courage even in the face of almost certain death. She saw in him someone worth saving, perhaps someone who could actually do what no one else had been able to do: kill the Minotaur and survive the Labyrinth. Ariadne made a decision. She would help him, but to do so she needed assistance herself, because she did not know the secret of navigating the Labyrinth. There was only one person who did: Daedalus, the man who had built it. And Daedalus was still in Crete, still serving as the king's architect and master craftsman, still bound to the palace by the weight of his complicity in the Labyrinth's creation and the Minotaur's existence. Ariadne went to Daedalus and asked him if there was a way to escape the Labyrinth. At first, the craftsman refused to tell her. He knew what she was planning, and helping the Athenian tributes would be treason against King Minos. But Ariadne was persuasive, and perhaps Daedalus, who had been living with the guilt of what he had created for years, felt some desire for redemption. Perhaps he saw a chance to make amends, at least partially, for the horror he had enabled. Daedalus told Ariadne the secret. It was simple, almost laughably so, but it would work. Thread. A ball of thread. If Theseus tied one end of the thread to the entrance of the labyrinth and unwound it as he went deeper, he could follow it back to find his way out. The thread would create a path through the confusion, a lifeline to the outside world. It wouldn't help him fight the Minotaur, but it would solve the seemingly impossible problem of escaping the maze. Ariadne also obtained a sword from somewhere in the palace armory, because Theseus would need a weapon to kill the monster. Armed with this knowledge and these tools, Ariadne arranged a secret meeting with Theseus on the night before the tributes were to be sent into the labyrinth. What passed between them in that meeting? Did Ariadne simply hand him the thread and sword and explain how to use them? Or was there more to their encounter? Some deeper connection forged in whispered conversation in the darkness? The ancient sources suggest there was. They spoke of love, of promises made, of a future imagined beyond the darkness of the labyrinth. Ariadne told Theseus she would help him, but she asked for something in return. If he survived, if he killed the Minotaur and escaped, he had to take her with him when he fled Crete. More than that, he had to marry her, to make her his wife and queen when he eventually inherited Athens. Ariadne was offering Theseus the tools he needed to survive, but she was also offering herself, her future, her entire life. She would be betraying her father, her family, her homeland. In return, she asked that Theseus never abandon her, that he commit to her completely. And Theseus, whether genuinely in love or simply willing to promise anything to get what he needed, agreed. He swore that if he survived, he would take Ariadne with him and marry her. She would be his wife, his queen, honored and cherished. He spoke with all the passion and sincerity a young man could muster, and Ariadne believed him. Perhaps she wanted to believe him so badly that she didn't look too closely at his words. Perhaps he meant them in the moment, fully intending to keep his promise. Or perhaps, even then, he was already thinking about how inconvenient it would be to bring a Cretan princess back to Athens, how politically complicated that would make his situation, but that would all come later. For now, in the darkness of the palace, they made their plans. Ariadne gave Theseus the ball of thread and the sword. She told him exactly where the entrance to the labyrinth was, how he would be sent in with the other tributes, what he needed to do. She promised that she would be waiting when he emerged, ready to flee with him and the other survivors. Theseus thanked her, perhaps kissed her, and returned to where the other tributes waited in their quarters. He showed them the thread and the sword, explained what Ariadne had told him, and tried to rally their courage for what would come the next day. Some of the tributes found hope in Theseus's plan. Others remained terrified, unable to believe they would truly survive, but all of them clung to the thread as the symbol of their salvation, literally and metaphorically. It was all they had. The next morning, the 14 tributes were led from their comfortable quarters down into the depths of the palace. The descent was long and winding, staircases leading ever downward. The air growing cooler and damper, the light fading until they were walking with torches to see the way. Finally, they came to a massive door of bronze, marked with the double axe symbol of the labyrinth. The door was opened, and beyond it stretched the entrance to the maze, corridors of stone disappearing into darkness. The guards pushed the tributes through the door, gave them no time to hesitate or resist. Theseus went first, holding the ball of thread, with the other tributes following close behind him. The door slammed shut behind them with a sound of terrible finality. They were in the labyrinth now. The only way out was through. Into the labyrinth, the slaying of the Minotaur. The first thing Theseus did, even before his eyes fully adjusted to the dimness, was tie one end of Ariadne's thread to an iron ring, set into the wall beside the door. He knotted it securely, testing it to make sure it wouldn't slip loose. This thread was their lifeline, their only hope of escape. Everything depended on it holding. Then, with the thread in his left hand and the sword in his right, Theseus began to move deeper into the labyrinth. The other tributes followed in a tight group, none of them wanting to be left behind in the darkness. They whispered to each other, trying to keep their courage up, but their voices sounded small and frightened in the oppressive quiet of the maze. The labyrinth was exactly as terrible as the legends had described it. Every corridor looked the same, bare stone walls, uniform height and width, no distinguishing features. They walked for what felt like hours, and Theseus had no idea if they were going deeper or if they had been moving in circles. The thread unwound steadily behind them, a thin line of safety in the confusion. They found signs of previous tributes. Here, a scrap of cloth that might have been torn from someone's garment. There, marks on the wall where someone had tried desperately to scratch a message or a direction. And bones, so many bones, scattered in the corridors, gnawed and cracked. The remains of those who had come before and never found their way back out. The tributes tried not to look at them, tried not to imagine themselves becoming similar remains. As they went deeper, they began to hear it. Breathing. Deep, rhythmic, bestial breathing that echoed through the stone corridors. And beneath the breathing, a sound like hooves on stone, the scrape of something massive moving in the darkness. The Minotaur was close. The tributes froze, terror overwhelming them. Some began to weep. Others prayed to whatever gods might hear them in this cursed place. Theseus whispered urgently to them. They needed to stay together. They needed to be ready to run when he gave the signal. If he could wound the Minotaur, distract it, the others might be able to escape back along the thread to the door. But they had to trust him. They had to follow his lead. Then, rounding a corner, they saw it. The Minotaur. It was massive, far larger than Theseus had imagined. The body was humanoid, but grotesquely muscular. Easily 7 feet tall, covered with coarse dark hair. But the head was that of a bull with great curved horns and eyes that reflected the torchlight with an animal gleam. It moved on 2 legs, but with a strange, loping gait that was neither fully human nor fully animal. And when it saw the tributes, it made a sound. Not quite a roar, not quite a bellow, but something in between. A sound of hunger and rage. And something else, something that might have been loneliness or pain, if such a creature could feel those things. The Minotaur charged. The other tributes scattered, screaming, some running back the way they had come, others pressing themselves against the walls, frozen in terror. But Theseus stood his ground. This was why he was here. This was the moment he had been preparing for. The Minotaur came at him with horrifying speed. Horns lowered to gore him. Theseus dodged at the last possible second, rolling under the charge. As he came up, he slashed with a sword, cutting across the Minotaur's flank. The blade bit deep, and the monster bellowed in pain and rage, spinning to face him again. What followed was a brutal fight in the darkness. The Minotaur had strength and size, but Theseus had speed and skill. Every time the monster charged, Theseus evaded, struck, and moved away. He was using the techniques he had learned in his 6 labors, not trying to overpower the beast, but wearing it down, cutting it, making it bleed. The Minotaur was incredibly difficult to kill. Its hide was tough, its muscles dense. Theseus's sword strikes that would have felled a human opponent seemed to barely slow the creature down. But slowly, incrementally, the wounds accumulated. The monster began to move more sluggishly. Its charges became less coordinated. It was bleeding from a dozen cuts, its strength fading. In some versions of the myth, the battle is described as quick and decisive, with Theseus striking a single killing blow. In others, it's a long, exhausting fight that tests every bit of the hero's stamina and courage. The truth, if there ever was a truth, to this mythical confrontation is lost to time, but the outcome is always the same. Theseus killed the Minotaur. The final blow came when the monster, weakened and desperate, made one last charge at Theseus. Instead of dodging, Theseus stepped into the charge, caught one of the horns with his free hand, and used the Minotaur's own momentum to drive his sword deep into the creature's throat. The blade plunged in up to the hilt, severing the major blood vessels there. The Minotaur made a sound that was almost human, almost like a cry of anguish, and then it collapsed, its massive weight crashing to the stone floor. Theseus stood over the body, breathing hard, his sword and his arms covered in the monster's blood. Around him, the other tributes slowly emerged from their hiding places, scarcely able to believe what they had witnessed. The Minotaur was dead. The monster that had killed so many, that had haunted Athens' nightmares for years, was nothing but a corpse on the stone floor of the labyrinth. Some versions of the story say that Theseus cut off the Minotaur's head as a trophy to show King Minos what he had done. Others say he left the body where it fell, too eager to escape to worry about proof of his deed. But all versions agree on what happened next. Theseus gathered the other tributes, took hold of Ariadne's thread, and began to follow it back through the labyrinth toward the entrance. This was almost as dangerous as the fight itself. If the thread broke, if it slipped loose, if they lost it in the darkness, they would be trapped forever in the maze, destined to wander until they died of thirst or hunger. But the thread held. Daedalus had chosen strong material, and Ariadne had wound it tightly, hand over hand. Theseus followed the thread back through the identical corridors, retracing the path they had taken into the depths. After what felt like hours, but might have been less, they saw light ahead, torchlight coming from beyond the bronze door. They emerged from the labyrinth, blinking in the sudden brightness, covered in the Minotaur's blood and their own sweat. The guards posted at the entrance stared at them in shock. This wasn't supposed to happen. No one ever came back out of the labyrinth. Before the guards could react, Theseus and the other tributes ran. They knew the way back to the harbor. Ariadne had told them. She had promised to meet them there, to have a ship ready for their escape. But could they get there before the alarm was raised? Could they flee Crete before King Minos learned what had happened? They ran through the palace corridors, the guards now pursuing them but confused, unsure what to do about these tributes who had somehow killed the Minotaur and escaped. They ran through the streets of Knossos down to the harbor where the ships rocked at anchor, and there, as promised, was Ariadne, standing on the dock beside the Athenian ship with the black sails, urging them to hurry. Theseus and the tributes scrambled aboard. Ariadne came with them, leaving behind her home, her family, everything she had ever known. The sailors, who had been waiting in the harbor in case any of the tributes miraculously survived, quickly raised the anchor and pushed off from the dock. As they did, Theseus made one final gesture of defiance toward Crete. He ordered the sailors to bore holes in the hulls of the Cretan ships still in the harbor, sabotaging them so they couldn't pursue. As their ship pulled away from Crete, they could see chaos erupting on shore, people running, shouting. Perhaps Minos himself appeared, watching the ship that carried away his daughter and the tributes who had killed his son. The ship with the black sails caught the wind and headed north toward Athens, toward home, toward what should have been a triumphant return. But that return would be tainted by tragedy, one tragedy that would occur almost immediately, and another that would unfold only when they reached Athens. The first tragedy was about Ariadne. The second was about a forgotten promise and black sails that should have been changed to white. Betrayal and tragedy. Naxos and the black sails. The journey from Crete to Athens should have taken only a few days, but the ship stopped at the island of Naxos to resupply with fresh water and food. Naxos was a beautiful island, sacred to Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, covered with vineyards and blessed with fertile soil. The ship anchored offshore at a small islet called Pelagia, and the Athenians disembarked to stretch their legs after days at sea. Ariadne, exhausted from the stress of the escape and the emotional turmoil of leaving her home, fell asleep on the beach. It was a peaceful sleep, perhaps the first truly peaceful sleep she'd had in days. The sun was warm on her face. The sound of the waves was soothing, and for a moment she could forget about everything that had happened and everything that lay ahead. When she woke, the sun had moved in the sky. She was alone on the beach. The ship was gone. Theseus and the other Athenians had departed while she slept, sailing away without her, abandoning her on Naxos without explanation or farewell. Ariadne's shock and anguish are the subject of some of the most poignant passages in ancient literature. She had betrayed her family for Theseus, had given up her home, her position, everything to help him. She'd saved his life and the lives of the other tributes, and this was how he repaid her, by leaving her stranded on a deserted island, alone and helpless. But why did Theseus abandon her? The ancient sources give different and sometimes contradictory explanations, as if even they could not agree on how to justify such a cruel act. Some versions claim that Dionysus appeared to Theseus in a dream and commanded him to leave Ariadne behind, because the god had chosen her as his bride and would not tolerate a mortal taking what belonged to a god. In this version, Theseus is portrayed as having no choice, forced by divine will to commit what would otherwise be an unforgivable betrayal. The god demanded it, and what choice did Theseus have but to obey? Other versions are less charitable to Theseus. They suggest that he simply grew tired of Ariadne, or that he fell in love with another woman he met on Naxos. Perhaps he realized that bringing a Cretan princess to Athens would be politically complicated, would raise questions about his loyalty, and create diplomatic problems. Perhaps he always intended to abandon her, and had simply lied about the marriage promise to get her help with the Labyrinth. Still, other accounts suggest the abandonment was accidental. In these versions, Theseus left the ship briefly, and Ariadne was still on shore sleeping when a sudden storm arose, forcing the ship to leave harbor quickly, or risk being dashed against the rocks. By the time the storm passed and Theseus could return, it was too late. Dionysus had already found Ariadne and claimed her. But regardless of the reason, the fact remains. Ariadne was abandoned. She woke alone on Naxos, betrayed by the man she loved, stranded far from home with no way to return to Crete and no way to reach Athens. Her grief, according to some accounts, was so overwhelming that she hanged herself from a tree. Other versions say she died of a broken heart or was killed by the goddess Artemis as punishment for some transgression. But the most famous version of what happened next is happier, at least superficially. Dionysus, the god of wine and divine madness, whose sacred island Naxos was, found Ariadne weeping on the beach. The god, struck by her beauty and moved by her plight, fell in love with her. He approached her in his chariot drawn by panthers, offered her wine from a golden cup, and comforted her. He told her she was destined for a greater fate than being the wife of a mortal king. She would be the wife of a god instead. Dionysus gave Ariadne a crown wrought by the god Hephaestus, adorned with gems that shone like stars. He married her in a ceremony blessed by all the gods, and afterward he placed her crown in the heavens as the constellation Corona Borealis, the northern crown, eternal and unchanging. Some versions say that Dionysus also made Ariadne immortal, bringing her to Mount Olympus to live among the gods. Others maintain that she remained mortal, but lived a long and happy life as Dionysus's favored consort, bearing him several children. This is meant to be a consolation, a happy ending to a story of betrayal. Ariadne lost a mortal prince, but gained a divine husband. She was elevated from princess of a doomed civilization to the wife of an immortal god. But there's something deeply unsatisfying about this resolution, something that feels like the gods trying to smooth over Theseus's cruelty with divine intervention. Ariadne still suffered. She was still abandoned. The fact that it turned out well in the end doesn't erase the pain of waking up alone on that beach. Meanwhile, Theseus sailed on toward Athens, either ignorant of what he had left behind or trying not to think about it. The other tributes, grateful for their survival, may not have questioned what happened to Ariadne, or perhaps they knew and said nothing, complicit in Theseus's betrayal by their silence. The ship with the black sails approached the coast of Attica, getting closer with every passing hour to the city, where Theseus's father waited anxiously for news. And here we come to the second tragedy, one born not of cruelty, but of forgetfulness, yet no less devastating for that. Remember Theseus's promise to his father before departing for Crete. If he survived, if he killed the Minotaur and returned home alive, he was to change the ship's sails from black to white. That way, Aegeus, watching from the cliffs for the ship's return, would know from a distance whether his son lived or died. But Theseus, in his triumph over the Minotaur, in the chaos of the escape from Crete, in his betrayal of Ariadne and whatever guilt or calculation that entailed, forgot. He simply forgot to change the sails. Perhaps he was too distracted by thoughts of Ariadne. Perhaps the victory over the Minotaur and the excitement of the escape drove everything else from his mind. Perhaps he was so confident in his success that it never occurred to him that his father would still be worrying. Whatever the reason, the ship approached Athens with black sails still flying. Aegeus had been watching for days, climbing to the highest cliff overlooking the sea, straining his eyes toward the horizon for any sign of the ship. When it finally appeared, when he saw the distinctive shape of the Athenian vessel coming toward the harbor, his heart must have leapt with hope. But then he saw the sails, black, still black, the color of death and mourning. In that instant, Aegeus believed his son was dead. Theseus had failed. The Minotaur had claimed him as it had claimed so many before. The king's son, the hero who had cleared the Isthmus road, the young man who had promised to end the tribute forever, all of it had come to nothing. Theseus was dead, devoured by the monster, lost in the labyrinth, overcome with grief, believing he had nothing left to live for. Aegeus threw himself from the cliff. His body plummeted down to the sea below, and he drowned in those waters. That sea, according to the myth, was afterward known as the Aegean, named for the king who had died there, a permanent reminder of the tragedy. Theseus, arriving in Athens triumphant, expecting celebration and honor, instead learned that his father was dead, killed by Theseus's own forgetfulness. The hero who had killed the Minotaur, who had freed Athens from the tribute, who had done what no one else could do, had inadvertently caused his own father's death through a simple oversight. The pattern in Theseus's story at this point becomes impossible to ignore. He made a promise to Ariadne and broke it, or had it broken for him by divine intervention. He made a promise to his father and forgot about it. In both cases, his actions or inactions led to tragedy for people who trusted him, who loved him, who had helped him. Theseus was a hero, yes, but he was also flawed, fallible, capable of causing harm through carelessness or calculated cruelty. Despite the circumstances of Aegeus's death, Theseus inherited the throne of Athens. He became king, and he proved to be a capable ruler in many ways. He united the various districts of Attica under Athenian rule, creating a more centralized and powerful state. He established democratic reforms, or at least the beginnings of them, that would eventually lead to Athens becoming the birthplace of democracy. He continued to have adventures, to perform heroic deeds, though none quite as famous as the slaying of the Minotaur. But the Minotaur's death marked a turning point, not just for Theseus, but for the balance of power in the Mediterranean. With the monster gone, with the tribute ended, Athens was freed from Crete's control, and Crete itself, according to some versions of the myth, never fully recovered from the loss of the Minotaur. The palace at Knossos would eventually be destroyed by earthquake and fire. The Minoan civilization would collapse, and power in the Aegean would shift northward to Mycenae, and eventually to Athens itself. The Minotaur, in this sense, was more than just a monster. It was a symbol of Cretan power, a tool of domination, a representation of the civilization's might. Its death foreshadowed the death of that civilization, the end of an age when Crete ruled the waves, and Athens paid tribute. The hero's victory over the monster was also, in a mythological sense, one culture's triumph over another. But before we leave the myth entirely and turn to its legacies, archaeological, psychological, and cultural, we should consider one more aspect of the story that often gets overlooked. What happened to Daedalus and his son Icarus, the craftsman who made both the Minotaur's conception and Theseus's escape possible? When Minos learned that someone had helped Theseus escape the labyrinth, he knew immediately who the traitor must be. Only Daedalus knew the secret of the maze. Only Daedalus could have told Ariadne about the thread. The craftsman, in helping Ariadne help Theseus, had betrayed the king who had given him sanctuary and patronage. Minos imprisoned Daedalus and his young son Icarus in a tower, planning to execute them for their treason. But Daedalus, being the genius he was, conceived a plan to escape. He gathered feathers and wax, and over weeks of secret work, he constructed 2 pairs of wings, one for himself and one for Icarus. The wings were held together with wax, and Daedalus warned his son repeatedly not to fly too close to the sun, because the heat would melt the wax, or too close to the sea, because the spray would dampen the feathers. They escaped the tower by flight, soaring over the Mediterranean, a sight so strange that sailors who saw them thought they were seeing gods. But Icarus, young and exhilarated by the sensation of flying, forgot his father's warnings. He flew higher and higher, closer to the sun, and the wax began to melt. The wings fell apart, and Icarus plummeted into the sea and drowned. Daedalus, heartbroken, retrieved his son's body and buried it on an island that was thereafter known as Icaria. This tragedy, the death of Icarus due to his father's invention and his own hubris, has become one of the most famous stories in all of mythology. A cautionary tale about the dangers of flying too high, about ambition exceeding prudence, about the terrible price of genius when it is used without wisdom. But in the context of the Minotaur myth, it also serves as a final consequence, a last ripple spreading out from that first decision by King Minos to keep the white bull instead of sacrificing it as promised. Daedalus's fate was tied to the Minotaur from the moment he built the wooden cow for Pasiphae. His genius enabled the creature's conception. His genius built the prison to contain it. His genius provided the means to escape that prison. And his genius cost him his son. The myth seems to be saying something about the responsibility that comes with exceptional talent, about the way that our creations can trap us as surely as any labyrinth. The labyrinth's secrets in the Minoan civilization. For thousands of years, the story of the Minotaur and the labyrinth was treated as pure myth, a fantastic tale with no basis in historical reality. The Palace of Knossos was known from ancient Greek texts, mentioned by Homer and other classical authors, but its location had been lost. Crete was a backwater, a provincial island in the Ottoman Empire, far from the centers of European power and learning. No one seriously thought there was anything to find there. Then, in 1878, a Cretan merchant and amateur archaeologist named Minos Kalokairinos began digging at a site near the modern city of Heraklion. He uncovered the remains of what appeared to be an ancient palace, rooms filled with artifacts, massive storage jars that suggested a civilization of considerable sophistication. But his work was cut short by Ottoman authorities, and it would be more than 20 years before serious excavation could continue. In 1900, a British archaeologist named Sir Arthur Evans purchased the site and began systematic excavations that would continue for decades. What Evans uncovered astonished the world. It was indeed a palace, but far more complex and extensive than anyone had imagined. The structure covered more than 2 acres, containing over 1,000 rooms connected by a maze-like system of corridors, staircases, and courtyards. The palace had multiple levels, elaborate plumbing systems, stunning frescoes depicting religious ceremonies and scenes of daily life, and storage facilities capable of supporting a large population. Evans, standing in these ruins, immediately thought of the labyrinth, the complex layout of the palace with its confusing array of similar-looking corridors and rooms seemed to match the description of Daedalus's maze. Evans named the civilization he had discovered Minoan, after the legendary King Minos, and he spent the rest of his life excavating, studying, and controversially reconstructing parts of the palace. The frescoes at Knossos proved especially significant. They depicted scenes of bull leaping, a practice where young men and women would grasp the horns of a charging bull and vault over its back in what appears to have been a religious ceremony or athletic contest. These images provided a potential real-world basis for the Minotaur myth. Perhaps, some scholars suggested, the tribute of Athenian youth was actually young people sent to participate in these dangerous bull-leaping ceremonies, many of whom died in the process. The myth of the Minotaur might have grown from the conflation of these ceremonies with the maze-like palace and the Minoan's clear cultural emphasis on bulls. The double-axe symbol, the Labyrinth, appeared throughout the palace, carved into walls and columns. Some scholars believe the word labyrinth derives from this symbol, making the labyrinth not a separate structure, but the palace itself, which was indeed labyrinthine in its layout. If this theory is correct, then the monster in the maze might have been symbolic rather than literal. Perhaps the bull leaping ceremonies, perhaps the king himself, perhaps the alien and frightening nature of Minoan culture to Greeks who encountered it. Evans's work revealed that the Minoan civilization had been far more advanced than the later Greek civilizations that told the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur. The Minoans had sophisticated art, complex religious practices, extensive trade networks throughout the Mediterranean, and architectural achievements that would not be matched in Greece for centuries. They had a writing system, Linear A, which remains undeciphered to this day, and they appear to have been a largely peaceful society, with no fortifications around their cities, suggesting they relied on their naval supremacy for protection. But the Minoan civilization collapsed around 1500 BCE, probably due to a combination of factors, including earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, the massive explosion of Thera, Santorini, and invasions by Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland. The palace at Knossos was destroyed, rebuilt, and destroyed again, eventually falling into ruins and being forgotten. When later Greeks told stories about Crete, they were describing a civilization that had ended centuries before their time, a culture they knew solely through fragmentary accounts and the impressive ruins that remained. This raises an intriguing possibility. What if the myth of Theseus killing the Minotaur is, in a very abstract way, a cultural memory of the mainland Greeks conquering Crete? Theseus, the Athenian hero, penetrates the heart of Cretan power, the palace, Labyrinth, destroys its most sacred symbol, the bull Minotaur, and escapes with his people, ending Athens' subservience to Crete. This could be a mythologized version of the historical shift in power from the Minoan civilization to the Mycenaean Greeks, with Theseus standing in for the Greek warriors who conquered Crete. Evans's reconstruction of Knossos, while invaluable for helping later generations have visualized the palace, has also been criticized by modern archaeologists. He used concrete and modern materials to rebuild walls and restore columns, making it difficult to distinguish between what was original and what was Evans's interpretation. Some critics argue that he essentially created a 20th century vision of what a Minoan palace should look like, based on his own aesthetic preferences and assumptions, rather than carefully preserving the actual archaeological evidence. But despite these criticisms, Evans' work opened up an entire new field of study. The Minoans went from being characters in a myth to being a real Bronze Age civilization that we can study through archaeology, art history, and even attempts to decipher their writing. The labyrinth became not just a mythical maze, but a potential metaphor for the palace of Knossos itself, and the Minotaur transformed from a literal monster into a symbol representing the alien and perhaps frightening aspects of Minoan culture, as perceived by later Greeks. Modern excavations at Knossos and other Minoan sites continue to reveal new information about this fascinating civilization. We now know they had indoor plumbing, sophisticated storage, and distribution systems for olive oil and grain, elaborate religious ceremonies, and artistic traditions that influenced later Greek art. The bull was clearly sacred to them, appearing again and again in their art and apparently playing a central role in their religious life. Whether there was ever a real Minotaur, a real labyrinth in the sense the myths describe, is a question we can never definitively answer. But what we can say is that the myth arose from a real cultural encounter between the later Greeks and the impressive, mysterious ruins of a civilization that had flourished and fallen centuries before. The Greeks saw the complex palace at Knossos, heard stories about bull ceremonies, and created from these fragments a myth that would resonate through the ages. The power of the myth lies not in its historical accuracy, but in its symbolic richness, the way it can be interpreted and reinterpreted across different ages and cultures, which brings us to the final section of our exploration. What does the myth of the Minotaur and Theseus mean? What psychological and symbolic depths can we find in this ancient story? Psychological and symbolic analysis. When we examine the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur through the lens of modern psychology and Joseph Campbell's hero's journey framework, we discover layers of meaning that the ancient Greeks might not have consciously intended, but which nevertheless resonate through the story with remarkable power. Campbell's hero's journey, outlined in his seminal work, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, describes a pattern that appears in myths worldwide. The hero begins in the ordinary world, receives a call to adventure, initially refuses or hesitates, encounters mentors, and receives magical gifts, crosses a threshold into a special world, faces trials, confronts a supreme ordeal, gains a reward, and returns home transformed. Theseus' story follows this pattern with interesting variations. His ordinary world is Troezen, where he lives in obscurity, not knowing his father's identity. His call to adventure comes in 2 stages. First, when he learns he is Aegeus' son and must journey to Athens to claim his birthright. And second, when he volunteers to face the Minotaur. Unlike many heroes who refuse the call initially, Theseus actively seeks out challenges, choosing the dangerous road to Athens and volunteering for the tribute when he could have avoided it. His mentors appear in multiple forms: his mother Aethra and grandfather Pythias, who raise and educate him, and later the gods Hermes and Athena, who watch over him in some versions of the myth. Ariadne, too, serves as a mentor figure, providing him with the knowledge, the thread that makes his quest possible. The magical gifts he receives are both tangible: his father's sword, Ariadne's thread, and intangible, divine favor, exceptional strength and intelligence. The threshold he crosses is literally the bronze door leading into the labyrinth, beyond which lies a world that operates by different rules than the ordinary world, a place of confusion, darkness, and death. The trials he faces include not just the Minotaur itself, but the psychological challenge of navigating the labyrinth without losing hope or direction, and the moral challenge of keeping his companions calm and united. The supreme ordeal is the confrontation with the Minotaur, a fight to the death in the darkness, with a creature that seems unbeatable. The reward is survival, the liberation of Athens from the tribute, and, according to his promise, marriage to Ariadne. But the return home is complicated by tragedy, Ariadne's abandonment, and Aegeus' death. suggesting that the hero's journey does not always end with uncomplicated triumph. What makes Theseus's journey particularly interesting from a psychological perspective is how it differs from Campbell's more straightforward template. The hero causes harm even as he achieves victory. He gains his kingdom through his father's death. He saves Athens, but betrays the woman who saved him. This moral ambiguity makes Theseus feel more human than many archetypal heroes, more flawed and complex. From a Jungian perspective, the labyrinth represents the unconscious mind, complex, confusing, filled with dark passages and hidden dangers. To enter the labyrinth is to descend into the unconscious, to confront what Carl Jung called the shadow, the repressed aspects of the self. The Minotaur, in this reading, is Theseus's shadow made manifest, a beast that must be confronted and integrated if the hero is to become whole. The thread that Ariadne provides represents consciousness itself, the thin line that connects us to reality and sanity as we explore the depths of our own minds. Without the thread, Theseus would become lost in the unconscious, unable to find his way back to the ordinary world. The thread is what separates productive self-exploration from madness, the tool that allows us to venture into dangerous psychological territory and return safely. Ariadne herself can be read as the anima figure in Jung's terminology, the feminine aspect of Theseus's psyche that he must acknowledge and integrate. Her abandonment on Naxos might symbolize Theseus's rejection of his own feminine qualities, his refusal to integrate the anima, which leads to an incomplete psychological development. The fact that Dionysus, the god of ecstasy, and the dissolution of boundaries claims Ariadne suggests that what Theseus rejects does not disappear, but instead enters the realm of the divine, the archetypal. The Minotaur itself is one of the richest symbols in all mythology. On the most obvious level, it represents the monstrous, the thing that should not be, the violation of natural categories, neither fully human nor fully animal, but something in between that terrifies us precisely because it defies classification. The monster is what happens when boundaries break down, when divine power violates natural law, when punishment exceeds crime. But the Minotaur is also a victim. It did not choose to be born. It did not ask for its nature or its appetites. It is imprisoned from birth, locked away in the darkness, fed but never loved, feared but never understood. In modern reinterpretations of the myth, particularly in works like Jorge Luis Borges's short story, The House of Asterion, the Minotaur is portrayed with profound sympathy. A lonely, confused creature waiting in the darkness for anyone to come and end its suffering. This reading transforms the myth into something far more complex than a simple hero slays monster story. If the Minotaur is a victim, what does it mean that Theseus kills it? Is this justice or just another tragedy? Is Theseus freeing Athens or destroying an innocent being who's already suffering in its own prison? The myth becomes a meditation on the nature of monstrosity, on who we label as monsters and why, on the possibility that what we call evil might be something else entirely, something wounded, something frightened, something that deserves pity more than a sword through its throat. The labyrinth, beyond its Jungian interpretation as the unconscious, can also be read as a symbol of any complex system that seems impossible to navigate: bureaucracy, politics, social hierarchies, even life itself with all its confusing choices and dead ends. We all walk through labyrinths of one kind or another, trying to find our way without getting lost, hoping we have a thread to follow back if we need it. In feminist readings of the myth, Ariadne has received considerable attention as a figure who enables the hero's success, but is then discarded when she's no longer useful. Her story becomes one of many myths that warn women about trusting men who promise them everything but deliver nothing. The thread she provides makes Theseus's victory possible, but her reward for this essential aid is abandonment. She is used, betrayed, and then literally left behind. Some feminist scholars have reclaimed Ariadne, arguing that her union with Dionysus is actually an upgrade, a transformation from being the possession of a mortal prince to being the equal partner of a god. Dionysus in this reading represents liberation, ecstasy, the breaking of social constraints, everything that the practical, political Theseus cannot offer. Ariadne's abandonment becomes not a tragedy, but the necessary precursor to her apotheosis. The Minotaur myth has also been analyzed through the lens of post-colonial theory, with Crete representing the colonized culture and Athens the colonizing power. The tribute is a form of economic exploitation, and Theseus's killing of the Minotaur is the colonizer's destruction of the colonized culture's most sacred symbols. That Crete never recovers from this loss mirrors how colonized societies often cannot survive the destruction of their cultural foundations. In modern popular culture, the Minotaur and the Labyrinth have been endlessly reinterpreted. The myth appears in novels, films, video games, and art with remarkable frequency, each new version finding something different to emphasize or explore. Sometimes the Minotaur is a straightforward monster to be defeated. Sometimes it's a tragic figure deserving of sympathy. Sometimes it doesn't exist at all, and the real monster is Minos, or the system that demanded the tribute in the first place. The endurance of this myth across more than 3,000 years suggests that it touches on something fundamental in human psychology: our fear of the monstrous, our need for heroes, our fascination with mazes and labyrinths as representations of life's complexity, our discomfort with things that violate natural categories, our sympathy for victims even when they're dangerous, our conflicted feelings about violence and the heroes who commit it. Conclusion and cultural impact. The story of Theseus and the Minotaur has survived across millennia because it speaks to universal human experiences and anxieties. It is a story about heroism and cowardice, about keeping promises and breaking them, about the line between justice and revenge, about what makes something or someone monstrous, about whether violence can ever truly solve the problems that create violence in the first place. For the ancient Athenians, Theseus was a founding hero, a king who unified their city-state and established its power. The Minotaur myth demonstrated Athens' triumph over Crete, its emergence from subservience to dominance. Annual festivals celebrated Theseus's deeds, and his supposed tomb in Athens became a place of honor. The ship that had carried him to Crete and back, or so they claimed, was preserved in the Athenian harbor, with its parts gradually replaced as they wore out, giving rise to the philosophical puzzle known as the ship of Theseus. If every part is replaced, is it still the same ship? Throughout the classical period and into the Roman era, the myth was retold in various forms. In tragedy, epic poetry, visual art, countless vases show Theseus fighting the Minotaur, his club raised, the monster collapsing before him. Mosaics depict the labyrinth in abstract geometric patterns, the Minotaur trapped at their center. The story was so familiar that writers could reference it with just a word or two, confident that their audience would understand. The Renaissance saw a revival of interest in classical mythology, and the Minotaur story was no exception. Artists like Titian, Rubens, and many others created paintings of Theseus's confrontation with the monster, of Ariadne abandoned on Naxos, of her discovery by Dionysus. These paintings often emphasize different aspects of the story: the heroism, the romance, the tragedy, depending on the artist's interests and the patron's desires. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the myth has continued to evolve and multiply. Pablo Picasso created a series of works exploring the Minotaur as a symbol of male sexuality and violence. Jorge Luis Borges wrote stories that reimagined the labyrinth as an infinite library or a garden of forking paths, using it as a metaphor for the universe itself. Films from the campy Clash of the Titans to serious art cinema have retold the story in countless ways. Video games have embraced the labyrinth as a fundamental game mechanic, the dungeon to be explored, the maze to be navigated, the boss monster to be defeated. The myth's structure maps perfectly onto gameplay, which is why Theseus's story has been adapted into games again and again, from ancient board games to modern digital recreations. Young adult literature has reimagined the myth from Ariadne's perspective, from the Minotaur's perspective, from the perspective of the forgotten tributes who died before Theseus arrived. These retellings often emphasize the tragedy of the story, the injustice of the tribute system, the complexity of characters who were once simply heroes or monsters. The archaeological site at Knossos remains one of the most popular tourist destinations in Greece, attracting hundreds of thousands of visitors each year who come to walk through the palace that might have inspired the Labyrinth myth, to see the frescoes of bull leapers, to stand in the throne room where King Minos might have sat. The site is a palimpsest of history, Bronze Age ruins, Arthur Evans's reconstructions, modern conservation efforts all layered together, making it difficult to separate the ancient from the modern, the real from the imagined. And in contemporary discussions of the mythology and culture, the Minotaur has become a symbol that can mean different things depending on context. It can represent the monstrous other, the thing we fear and reject. It can represent the victim of circumstance born into a situation not of its making. It can represent the sacred bull of Minoan religion destroyed by Mycenaean invaders. It can represent our own repressed desires and fears, the shadow self waiting in the darkness of our unconscious. The thread of Ariadne has entered our language as a metaphor for the guiding clue that helps us solve a complex problem, the one element that makes sense of confusion. When we say something provided us with an Ariadne's thread to understanding, we're invoking this ancient myth, acknowledging that without that crucial insight, we would remain lost in the labyrinth of complexity. As you drift towards sleep, consider the labyrinth, consider the thread. Consider the monster waiting in the dark and the hero who must face it. Consider what you might find if you descended into your own depths. What monsters or treasures might await you there. What thread you might need to find your way back. The myth of Theseus and the Minotaur is not just an ancient story. It is a map of the human psyche, a guide to navigating the mazes we all must walk through, a reminder that heroism is complicated, that monsters are sometimes tragic, and that every victory carries with it the possibility of unintended consequences. The labyrinth endures because we all walk through labyrinths of one kind or another. The Minotaur endures because we all fear the monster in the dark. And Theseus endures because we all need heroes, even flawed ones, even ones who fail as often as they succeed, even ones who save the day but break their promises. As the corridors asleep wind around you, as you descend into dreams that have their own labyrinths and their own monsters, remember that you carry your own thread, your own consciousness, your own way of finding your way back. The Minotaur waits in everyone's personal labyrinth. The question is whether we have the courage of Theseus to face it, the wisdom of Ariadne to know when to offer help, and the compassion to understand that sometimes monsters are made, not born. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of mythology's most enduring tales, this exploration of the Minotaur's labyrinth and Theseus's heroic yet flawed quest, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the Mythos Deep Dive. We bring you comprehensive explorations of classical mythology every week, uncovering the layers of meaning in stories that have shaped human culture for thousands of years. Until next time, may you navigate your own labyrinths with wisdom and courage, and may you emerge transformed by the journey.